Some evangelical leaders have critiqued or criticized the 2011 edition of the NIV based on translation philosophy and in particular their application of gender-neutral language. What should be the most pressing concerns for modern translations? Linguistic precision, readability, or cultural engagement? What should be the leading concerns for modern translators?
Well, all of them are important. The most important is to get across the truth of what the original text says. That's true for all translation. Well, what you must face, I think, is the fact that sometimes getting across the truth is not necessarily done in the most direct way. For example, I clear my throat and say, "Excuse me, I've got a frog in my throat." Now, I was brought up in French and English. You never say in French, "I've got a frog in my throat." Literally in French you say, "I've got the cat in the throat." Now, if you think it's strange for Frenchmen to have cats in their throat, believe me, they think it's strange for you to have a frog in yours. So now you're translating a text that says, Joe Bloggs had a frog in his throat and then began to speak. How do you translate that into French? Well, it depends, I would say. It's an idiomatic expression in English. If you want the corresponding idiomatic expression in French, you would translate it, Monsieur Bloggs avait le chat dans la gorge. He had the cat in the throat. Go on from there. But supposing, to make things more complicated, in the original English text, the word cat had some kind of pun overtone with something theologically important in the rest of the text. Well, then you got a problem. You want to preserve the word cat because it's got an overtone, but if you say, rather you want to preserve the word frog because it's got some sort of overtone. You don't want to have the word cat in the French text. You want the word frog in the French text. But if you say frog, then they're going to think it's really, really strange. It's an artificial expression. Where does that come from? And so forth. So then you might make another decision. Well, you'll put in the word cat to make it idiomatic and then put a little asterisk in and a footnote down at the bottom of the page saying what I really want you to understand is that the original word is frog because in English you have a frog in the throat rather than a cat, and explain the pun or whatever it is in the other language so that you have an extra note in for explanatory purposes. Now there are just scores and scores and scores and scores and scores of instances of that sort of thing as you move from one language to another language in any sustained translation. And even something like the passive voice, for example, good Greek demands for transitive verbs a very generous use of the passive voice. Good English style demands a generous use of the active voice. So if something's written in idiomatic Greek, do you put it into idiomatic English and change it to the active voice? In some cases, it makes no difference. It's more idiomatic. In some cases, you could argue that you're losing something of the ambiguity of who the actual author is in the passive voice, and you don't want to do that, so you maintain the passive voice. And then you work in Neo-Melanesian languages where they don't even have a passive voice, and you have to go to the active voice. And that's the way translators are facing decisions again and again and again and again. So I like formulas like as direct a translation as you can, as flexible as you must. But then there are all kinds of judgment calls about where the can and the must actually come in. Even questions like sentence length vary so much. In English, we tend to have paragraphs with additional coordinate sentences, coordinate clauses, and this happened, and this happened, and then this happened, and then this happened, whereas Greek much prefers to use subordination of clauses with lots of participles and long, long, long sentences with participles built on subordinate clauses, and so on. And so most of our English translations are more flexible than the Greek sentence structure allows. It's almost necessary to make sense of it in the receptor language. Now, when it comes to the gender-neutral stuff, again, one has to be careful, I would argue. Men of Israel, hear me this day. Okay, there was no doubt that when that was written, men of Israel, in a certain context where clearly women were present, included men and women. There is no doubt that in many parts of earlier English, men was an expression that could refer to both sexes. But if you grant that that is decreasingly the case today, and on many ears men sounds as if it is restrictive, then in terms of referent, that is what the word is in fact actually referring to, it's actually more accurate to say men and women. I would say that's a more accurate translation under those circumstances, even though it's a less direct translation. Because if your hearers or readers are hearing you to be saying men only, and the women are excluded, or the women weren't there, when in point of fact they were there, then it's not fair translation to say men, because the word men has become more restricted in its semantic range. Now, obviously, there will be room for some discussion about what the overtones really are and the like. But I think that the 2011 NIV people tried pretty hard to get it right. In my view, that today's NIV, the earlier one, which went a little farther in gender-neutral language, went too far because they saw that the changes are coming in the English language, but then they tried to absolutize those changes and fail to recognize that we still do use words like mankind in certain contexts and the like. Well, the 2011 NIV restores some of the mankinds and things like that rather than humankind in every place, and tries to get the balance about where the current language is being used. So I don't want to argue that the 2011 is a good translation because it is more understandable than some others, though I think it is, or simply to argue that it is more flexible and understands English usage a little better than some other translations, though I think it is. I also want to argue that in the majority of the disputed cases, it's actually more accurate because it is recognizing that the more direct translation can actually lead you astray on occasion, precisely because it fails to note how the language itself has changed.